Metaphor ReFantazio, a game developed by Studio Zero and Atlus, has one of those titles that doesn't tell you a great deal about what you're about to sink 70 hours of your life into. Releasing on the 11th of October for PlayStation 4, 5, Xbox Series and PC, ReFantazio is an RPG adventure game that shares some elements with the Persona games. This includes game director Katsura Hoshino, who was involved in the development of Personas 3, 4, and 5. There are some obvious similarities early on that are going to help drive this narrative too, such as the presence of anime teens, turn-based combat, and the time management aspect of the game. However, there are some clear points of separation. The biggest of these is the fantasy nature of this game. There's a pseudo-occult vibe running through all of the Persona games, and that is anchored upon a foundation of presenting real-world normalities, like school life or office buildings, against the objective insanity of violently ripping masks off or shooting yourself in the head to summon inner strength. These games are anchored in the real world and fighting off threats that are seeping into reality. In contrast, Metaphor gives you the entire fantasy kingdom of Uchronia to explore, which is a world of tribal prejudice and xenophobia, with magical powers and evil monstrosities to contend with. The conduit for this adventure is a blue-haired protagonist. Players can name this character, but he's originally known only as the Travelling Boy. He arrives in the capital city of the nation shortly after the assassination of the king, when tensions are understandably high. Assisted by a fairy called Gallica, our protagonist joins the guard to help pass on a message, but through a series of events, competes in a contest for the throne. The late king's final act was to use his incredible magical power to determine that the candidate who has the most trust of the people, by a specific date, will inherit the throne, regardless of their race, tribe, or position.
The people of my land desire a new king, and I shall provide.
This sets up the bulk of the narrative, as the leading candidates from the military and church present themselves, and the state organises an official tournament that asks candidates to travel between the major cities in the kingdom. It's like a reality TV show, but the prize is the crown, not an arbitrary sum of money and 15 minutes of fame. There's not much more that I'm willing to say about the narrative at this point, as there are lots of individual bits that could be considered spoilers. What I will say is that this plot is well paced, well told, and does a good job of portraying the racial hierarchy in this land. This is mostly told through in-engine cutscenes and written dialogue, with some of these voiced, but there is the occasional hand-drawn animation for the key story moments. This narrative is excellent, with various twists and turns until the final quarter. The latter stages of the plot have a reveal that felt a bit flat and a bit forced. For me personally, it entered eye-roll territory, but the game did do a decent job of getting me emotionally invested up until that point. It did feel a little disappointing though, given the success that led up to it and that succeeded it. For all that Metaphor's setting might be different to the Persona games, when it comes to collecting a group of friends and comrades to help you in your quest, that feels very familiar. Early on, characters like Fallen Noble Stroll and former Royal Knight Hulkenberg present necessary but cliché personas, pun very much intended. Both serve a function, but they aren't that interesting. Deliberately so, I believe, as you need these paint-by-numbers anchor points that are solid and steady. What really tips this game's character writing into the upper echelon was the introduction of a Ujif Haizme. Ujifs are bat-like creatures, and one of the game's lesser tribes, who are often victimized. When you first meet him, he's riddled with guilt and dishonor and ready to die, willing to offer his head for a chance to serve a greater cause. Once his plot arc concludes, he's a conduit for learning about the Ujif's unique customs for burial, and how his clan's indecisiveness in trade endeavours cost their young their future. This is interesting as it contributes to your knowledge on why somebody looking from the outside in on this tribe might want to malign them or might view them in a particular way, which helps reinforce one of the key narrative threads about this world's hierarchy. This helps pull back the curtain on how decades of misunderstanding have created divides between clans. Let's talk about general gameplay. The game uses a date system to progress the plot, with key events taking place on certain dates, and some days are set aside for narrative actions or cutscenes. Each day is split into two relevant sections, the daytime and the evening, and usually you can perform one action during each period. Then the calendar rolls forward to the next day. This is one of the most divisive elements of the Persona series, and I see it being very much the same here. The game will tell you that you have a set number of days left to complete an action, like clearing a dungeon, and this time pressure can be oppressive and off-putting to some players, particularly those who like to progress at their own pace. Mechanically speaking, the game does not move forward unless you perform an action that takes up time, and this includes speaking to your companions, travelling to another village, or going into a dungeon and fighting enemies. One additional note here is that none of your companions' personal stories require bond points before the next stage becomes active. Most of these are instead gated behind story progress or the protagonist's aptitude levels, like courage, charisma, and wisdom. Those can be leveled up by performing various actions throughout the game. There's also little to no fan service in this game, other than a pink-haired woman called Katharina, who's likely a nod to another Atlus title. Metaphor's time management system is certainly more lenient than the one in Persona 5 or Persona 3 Reload, where the room for error, if you want to do everything in a single playthrough, is very, very fine. There's still an element of efficiency and planning involved, and it's not advisable to go into a dungeon and leave without finishing everything you can there. At the end of the game, I had around 10 days left where I could make no further progression, and had done every side quest and activity. So I am confident there is a greater margin for error here if you make a few mistakes. The majority of the game is told from a third-person perspective, as you control the travelling boy to run around cities and dungeons. Cities have shops and non-combat activities, and are often where your companions are. You can talk with them to progress their own storylines, or purchase gear and items to prepare for your next dungeon run. In cities, the protagonist can ride on his magical sword, like a skateboard, for a bit of faster travel, and you can quickly jump between locations you've visited already. There are a few different cities in the game, each serves as a hub for a period of time, but the ones that stand out are the capital of Grand Trad and the water city of Brylehaven. These are all designed well enough, but for the sake of their purpose as hub cities, these aren't that complex in layout or design. They serve more practical sensibilities than innovative ones. Different days and times make different activities available, and as you progress and unlock more cities, you get access to new supporters and quests. Along with the primary narrative activity, which is shown at the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can pick up side quests. These often unlock new optional locations that you can explore, or grant bonuses to the travelling boy's stats. Most of these locations are dungeons you can explore. Within these you control the protagonist as you would in cities, but cannot ride your sword. Instead, you have your weapon drawn and can attack monsters to stun them and gain an advantage. If you are significantly higher level than the monster, you can defeat them outright without needing to go into turn-based combat. The way that the game uses its time management system to control the pacing of both the narrative and progression means that for the majority of your time playing, you will be fighting enemies of a similar level that provide an appropriate challenge. That brings us nicely on to combat. Combat is turn-based and sees the player party field up to 4 combatants, and you have the usual choice of regular attacks, abilities, items, or guarding. The game also has a serviceable auto-battle, which you can use if you want certain characters to act on their own. But I'd recommend giving commands yourself, as MP management is key early on. The bulk of the combat is heavily focused on hitting weaknesses, and doing so grants another action point for your turn. This is also true if your foes hit your weakness. Turns are given in order between your characters. For a standard party of 4 characters, gaining a 5th action point means that the first character that took an action gets a second action, regardless of who actually hit the weakness. The primary way to achieve extra actions is to use archetype abilities. Archetypes are similar to a traditional RPG class or job system, which sees each character embody the role of a hero. Each character has one of these that their stats are better suited to, usually the one they start with, and more advanced archetypes can be unlocked later. All of these reach a max level of 20, and you unlock more of these using the game's currencies as you progress. Abilities can be inherited into other archetypes, so a Master of the Thief archetype can switch to the merchant archetype and still use the steal command, as long as you pay the cost to inherit the skill. This system can also be used to move passive abilities over as well, which allows a class that is normally weak to a specific element to increase evasion against that type of attack. Maxing out an archetype provides a permanent stat boost to that character, but max level archetypes can still acquire experience in the form of items that can then be used to level other archetypes, so you're not harshly punished for sticking with the ones you like. This combat system is excellent. It relies on player knowledge and experience as well as smart decision making to give you an edge, and although you can supplement your characters with weapons, armor and accessories, choosing the right archetype for the right job is more important to success. That said, I did find the early game to be quite difficult, even on the normal difficulty. I did struggle and the deaths piled up until I received my 4th team member. If I had to guess, I'd say this is where my experience with the Persona games hurts me, as I was expecting to have certain abilities and functions that I didn't have here. The biggest omission or downside of the archetype system is that you cannot switch these in battle, only your companions. So choosing the right setup beforehand is a key part of combat. This likely resulted in a lot of my early deaths, as I was focused on trying to make specific archetypes I was leveling up kind of work, rather than using the one best suited for the encounter. Outside of archetypes, progression is fairly linear. Each new town has new weapons and armor to buy, and you level up as you gain more experience. The larger the gap between your level and your enemies, the less experience you gain. As mentioned previously, the game goes out of its way to keep a firm hand on its pacing, and that includes preventing hardcore grinding to over-level for upcoming encounters. There ends up being such a diminishing return on EXP when you're trying to do this that grinding stops being worth the effort quite quickly. You're also unlikely to want to grind in the side dungeons for too long. These are generic, and in particular the tower dungeons feel very repetitive. You can find some efficient routes by running up and down these towers, but there's nothing particularly interesting in their design to make visiting them exciting other than for their original quest purpose. While combat and progression are generally excellent, the game's performance is mixed. The UI and menus are excellent, with every visual element of presentation well thought out. These are very reminiscent of Persona 5, and that is certainly high praise. The bulk of the visuals in this game use that same engine, which is to say they are fairly dated. Due to the anime art style, the game will hold up for years to come. But there's no denying that this isn't the best looking graphically, and doesn't compare favourably to other Atlus games. Say for example, Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance. Granted, I like this art style, but there is an aged feeling in this engine. The character modelling is passable, but there are some areas on each model that you look at and think, this was made in the early PS4 Xbox One era, rather than in the middle of the PS5 Xbox Series lifecycle. In terms of raw performance, I'm playing the Steam version of the game on PC, and this performed like Persona 3 Reload did. There are some noticeable issues, particularly if you increase the rendering scale option in the settings. This is a massive hit to performance on what is otherwise a fairly solid 50 to 60 FPS, but this has an effect of clearing up some of the modelling issues. Even on enthusiast grade hardware, dialing this setting up to max dropped my FPS below 60, which leaves me with some concerns about how this game looks or performs on more mid-tier hardware. You may have to make a few other graphical sacrifices to get this game to run well, consistently. Finally, let's talk voice acting and sound. I have no complaints with the English audio here. Everybody did their job admirably with a strong mix of accents.
My name is Iselin Pacelli Maytal Hulkenberg. I am knight, I am commander, and last of the honor guard!
This is the way of the real world, little lordling!
You call this real? Leaders abandon their people and the innocent die by their scorn. If that's the real world, then it can die alongside you!
While there are some moments in the narrative I would have preferred to be voiced over generic noises and written text, I do understand the scale of the game makes that quite an arduous task. The game's soundtracks is one of its highlights, with some of it heavily orchestral, and at times others like a celebration of big band music. There's a real sense of regality and fanfare too, which helps prop up the game's setting. I do have some small gripes, like hearing the same tracks in combat a bit too often, and no matter how excellent they are, it does start to fray on your nerves a little. There is no denying that Metaphor ReFantazio is an excellent game. It's oozing with style, it's dripping with character development, and it's bleeding with a relentless outpouring of progression, both narratively and in terms of combat mechanics. There's also a nostalgically familiar core gameplay loop that harkens back to two of the JRPG genre's biggest staples: turn-based combat, class systems. There's a chaotic mix of religious fanatics, disillusioned masses, and revenge in a 70-hour epic that is definitely not for everyone. But I can see those who've been perhaps put off by the more contained playing area or the intense high school drama subplots of the Persona games. Those people will find their gaming happy place with this, and it all comes down to a preference in setting. If you play games for the mechanics, progression, characters, or narrative, then clear your schedule.